Resident Evil 2 is the most important night in the entire franchise. Everything that came before it, the mansion, the T-Virus, Umbrella's 30 years of secrets, collided in a single city on a single evening. And everything that came after it, Leon's career, Claire's search, Ada's double life, Sherry's immunity, HUNK's delivery, started here. Tonight, I'm covering the complete story of that night. Leon and Claire arriving in a city that was already dead. Ada working an angle nobody saw coming. Sherry running from her own father. Birkin consuming himself from the inside out. And HUNK alone in the sewers, carrying the only thing that mattered to Umbrella while everyone else died around him. This is the full story of Resident Evil 2, told from every angle, in order, start to finish. If you want more deep dives like this, a like and a subscribe helps more than you know. On September 22nd, 1998, a specialized USS unit designated Alpha Team infiltrated the underground laboratory beneath Raccoon City. Led by the operative known as HUNK, their objective was the forced retrieval of the G-Virus from its creator, William Birkin. The tension within the facility reached a critical point when Birkin refused to surrender his life's work to the corporate squad. In the ensuing struggle, Birkin was struck by several rounds of submachine gun fire, leaving him in a terminal state on the laboratory floor. As the USS team prepared to depart with the viral samples, Birkin utilized his final moments of consciousness to inject himself with the concentrated G-Virus. This action triggered a violent and immediate mutation that transformed the dying scientist into a biological juggernaut. Driven by a primitive instinct for survival and revenge, the mutated Birkin pursued the Alpha Team into the municipal sewer system. He slaughtered the elite soldiers with ease, leaving the tunnels filled with biological remains and discarded corporate equipment. The combat in the sewers caused the destruction of several T-Virus storage vials that were being carried by the team. The shattered glass released the pathogen into the damp environment, where it was quickly ingested by the local rat population. These rodents became the primary vectors for the coming disaster, moving through the drainage pipes to reach the urban center. The prehistoric fire was no longer contained within a laboratory. It was being carried into the homes of the citizens by the very pests they lived alongside. The contaminated rats successfully introduced the virus into the city's primary water supply and the local ecosystem. This effectively poisoned the urban population before a single zombie appeared on the streets. The organization had failed to contain its most volatile assets, and the resulting leak was the start of an irreversible biological collapse. The sewer massacre was the clinical starting point for the total destruction of Raccoon City. The fire had been lit, and the city was unaware that it was already burning from within. The organization monitored the situation with a detached interest, recording the initial signs of the outbreak. They realized that the T-Virus leak provided a unique opportunity to study the pathogen's performance in a dense population. Instead of initiating a full evacuation, they allowed the infection to spread while preparing their tactical cleanup teams. The death of the Alpha Team was considered an acceptable cost for the acquisition of new research data. Raccoon City was officially designated as a live fire testing ground for the pharmaceutical giant. Part 2. The week nobody noticed. How Raccoon City died before Leon and Claire ever got there. From September 22nd to September 29th, the city suffered through a period of biological stagnation, known as the slow burn. The initial symptoms of the outbreak were misdiagnosed as a localized fever or a strange cannibal disease. Local hospitals began to report a surge in patients suffering from massive necrosis and extreme mental decay. The authorities were slow to recognize the pattern, allowing the infection to spread through the crowded residential districts without a tactical response. As the week progressed, the frequency of violent attacks increased significantly. What started as isolated reports of biting incidents evolved into a citywide wave of predatory aggression. The municipal morgues were overwhelmed by the number of bodies that refused to remain deceased. The RPD attempted to establish a quarantine perimeter, but the volume of the infected made the containment impossible. The social order was dissolving into a primal struggle for survival as the infrastructure failed. The hospitals became the primary centers of the infection, acting as ground zero for the urban collapse. Overworked medical staff were consumed by the very patients they were trying to treat. The lack of accurate information from the corporate handlers ensured that the city's defense was disorganized and reactive. By the time the government considered a total lockdown, the viral load had reached a critical mass. The city was a graveyard of abandoned vehicles and burning buildings. The corporate elite utilized this week to erase their digital tracks and evacuate high-value assets. They maintained a facade of normalcy while the streets were being claimed by the undead. The RPD officers were left to fight a war without the proper equipment or knowledge of the enemy. The bravery of the local police was exploited by the company to keep the population contained while the archives were secured. The slow burn was a calculated phase of the corporate plan. By the time the 29th of September arrived, the city was officially dead. The power grid was failing, and the communications were silent. Most of the survivors had already been converted into biological resources for the virus. The city had become a closed ecosystem of prehistoric fire, waiting for the final cleanup strike. Raccoon City was no longer a human settlement. It was a sprawling laboratory for the T-virus. The heroes were entering a tomb that had been sealed for 48 hours. Part 3, September 29th, 11 p.m. The arrival of Leon and Claire. At 11 p.m. on September 29th, Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield arrived in the city outskirts simultaneously. Leon was traveling to report for his first day of duty at the RPD, unaware that his department had already collapsed. Claire was searching for her brother, Chris, who had vanished following the mansion incident. They were two strangers moving toward a shared nightmare, driven by their own separate motives. They met at an isolated gas station that had already been claimed by the infection. The encounter at the gas station was their first direct confrontation with the reanimated dead. They were forced to use their limited supplies to fight off a swarm of zombies that had cornered them in the store. This sudden violence shattered their expectations of a routine entry into the city. They managed to escape the immediate threat and board an abandoned police cruiser to reach the urban center. The tactical reality of the mission was now one of absolute survival against an unknown pathogen. As they drove into the heart of the city, the scale of the disaster became undeniable. The streets were filled with burning wreckage and the sounds of distant gunfire. They realized that the city had already officially died 48 hours prior to their arrival. The police barricades were empty, and the emergency sirens were silent. They were moving through an urban graveyard where the only living things were the monsters in the shadows. The city was a hollow shell of its former self. The meeting between the rookie officer and the student was a moment of accidental synchronization. They agreed to cooperate to reach the police station, which they believed to be a safe harbor. This partnership was the only thing that allowed them to survive the initial chaos of the entry. They were two individuals who should never have met, brought together by the total failure of the municipal authority. Their arrival was the start of the final chapter of the Raccoon City incident. The atmosphere of the city was one of oppressive dread. Every alleyway and every building held the potential for a lethal encounter. They were forced to navigate a maze of debris while managing their mounting fear. The organization's research was on full display in the streets, but they lacked the context to understand it. They were simply survivors trying to reach a goal that no longer existed. The night was young, and the prehistoric fire was waiting for them in the dark. Section 2, Into the City. Part 4, The Burning Streets. The Separation of the Survivors. The journey toward the police station was interrupted by a high-speed collision with a runaway fuel truck. The massive explosion created a wall of fire that physically separated Leon and Claire in the middle of the street. This accident forced them to navigate the maze of wreckage and monsters alone on foot. They agreed to rendezvous at the RPD building, which stood as the only landmark in the burning urban landscape. The separation was the first major tactical challenge of the night. Leon moved through the back alleys, utilizing his police training to evade the larger groups of the infected. He discovered that the city's geography had been transformed into a series of lethal bottlenecks. The narrow passages were filled with the remains of the civilian population, creating a visceral record of the outbreak. He had to manage his limited ammunition while searching for a clear path to the station. The burning streets were a testing ground for his rookie survival instincts. Claire navigated the commercial districts, searching for any sign of her brother's presence. She encountered the same level of biological aggression, realizing that the entire city was an active combat zone. The fire provided a constant visual reminder of the destruction of the social order. She moved with a desperate speed, driven by her goal of finding Chris before the city was completely lost. The separation had forced her to become an independent tactical actor in a world of monsters. The agreement to meet at the station provided them with a shared objective that kept them moving through the chaos. They were two ghosts in the machines of the city, separated by a fire that symbolized the end of the 1998 era. The wreckage of the truck was the grave of their initial partnership, forcing them to find their own ways to the truth. The city was watching their progress, recording the data of their individual struggles. The streets were the first layer of the labyrinth. The navigation of the burning streets was a clinical lesson in environmental danger. Every step required a calculation of risk and a management of resources. They discovered that the zombies were not the only threat. The fires and the structural collapses were equally lethal. The city was eating itself alive, and the survivors were caught in the middle of the feast. The separation had increased their vulnerability, but it had also doubled the amount of evidence they would uncover. The night was just beginning. Part 5. Robert Kendo. The Tragedy of the Gun Shop. In his search for a path to the station, Leon encountered Robert Kendo, the owner of the local gun shop. Robert was a broken man who had barricaded himself in his store to protect his young daughter, Emma. He was a veteran of the community who had witnessed the total collapse of his world in a single week. The meeting was a visceral demonstration of the human cost of the T-virus. Robert was no longer a businessman. He was a desperate father fighting a losing war. Emma Kendo, had been bitten during the initial outbreak and was in the final stages of the viral mutation. Robert's refusal to abandon her showed the depth of his paternal loyalty, even in the face of absolute biological horror. This moment proved to Leon that in Raccoon City there were no good endings. Every survivor carried a degree of tragedy that could not be healed by tactical success. The gun shop was a sanctuary of grief and ammunition. The eventual death of Robert and Emma was a clinical confirmation of the virus's reach. The infection did not spare the innocent or the prepared. Robert's tactical expertise and his stock of weapons were insufficient to protect his family from the microscopic threat. This encounter forced Leon to confront the reality of his duty. He was not there to save everyone, and he was there to survive the disaster. The Kendo tragedy was the first nail in the coffin of his rookie idealism. The gun shop itself was a tactical resource that Leon utilized to replenish his gear. However, the cost of the supplies was the memory of a father's despair. This moment established the tone for the rest of his career. He learned that the biological weapons were not just military tools. They were the destroyers of families. Robert Kendo was a silent witness to the corporate negligence that had poisoned his city. He was a victim of the slow burn that nobody noticed. The encounter with Kendo served as a psychological filter for Leon. It hardened his resolve to find the people responsible for the leak. He realized that the pharmaceutical company had traded the lives of citizens like Robert for the sake of a biological commodity. The gun shop was a localized graveyard that represented the failure of the municipal authority. Leon moved forward into the night with a heavier heart and a more focused mission. The tragedy of the daughter was the truth of the city. Part 6. Arriving at the RPD, the Fallen Museum. The police station was an architectural masterpiece that had formerly functioned as a municipal art museum. It was a fortress of traps, puzzles, and hidden passages, designed by the same philosophy that built the Spencer Mansion. When the outbreak began, the building was utilized as a makeshift refugee center for the surviving citizens. However, this function failed catastrophically as the infection spread within the confined halls. By the time Leon and Claire arrived, the station was a biological tomb. The interior of the building was a visceral record of the RPD's final stand. The main hall was filled with the blood of officers who had tried to hold the line against the overwhelming swarm. The luxury of the museum's decor created a grotesque contrast with the piles of biological remains. The station had been transformed from a place of law into a place of slaughter. The traps and the mechanical locks had become barriers for the survivors instead of protection against the dead. The survivors discovered that the station's security protocols had been sabotaged from within. The puzzles were a way to test the intellect of the remaining officers while slowing their escape. The building was a clinical environment where the organization monitored the final moments of the police department. The RPD was the primary obstacle to the corporate cleanup, and its destruction was a tactical necessity. The station was the center of a maze that was designed to kill. Leon and Claire navigated the blood-stained corridors, piecing together the story of the precinct's fall. They found the logs of the officers who had fought until their last magazines were empty. The station was a monument to the bravery of men who were fighting an enemy they did not understand. It was also a monument to the betrayal of the city's leadership. The museum was hiding a dark industrial heart that was linked directly to the corporate laboratories. The arrival at the station was a moment of false hope. They expected to find an organized rescue, but they only found a cemetery of marble and steel. The building was a cage that forced them to solve the architect's puzzles to find a way out. Every door they opened revealed a new horror and a new piece of the corporate conspiracy. The RPD was the gateway to the underground, and its fall was the final sign that the city was beyond saving. The night was closing in. Part 7. Marvin Branner, the last officer standing. Lieutenant Marvin Branner was the final officer of the RPD still capable of providing tactical guidance to the newcomers. He was found in the main hall, suffering from a lethal bite sustained while saving other survivors during the initial evacuation. Marvin was a professional who maintained his composure even as the virus began to consume his nervous system. He served as the final bridge between the old world of the law and the new world of the prehistoric fire. Marvin gave Leon his combat knife and a final tactical order: do not hesitate and save yourself. This command was a clinical assessment of the city's status. He knew that the department was gone and that the only remaining mission was the escape of the healthy. Marvin's refusal to accept medical help showed his understanding of his own terminal mutation. He was a man who chose to die as an officer of the law rather than a biological asset. The symbolic gift of the knife represented the passing of the tactical torch to the rookie officer. Leon was no longer a trainee. He was the primary responder to a global disaster. Marvin's presence in the hall provided the survivors with a moral anchor in a city of madness. He was the last representative of the duty that had defined the precinct. His eventual turn into a zombie was the final nail in the coffin for the RPD. The law was dead. His transformation was a documented tragedy that Leon was forced to witness. It proved that the virus did not respect the character or the rank of the host. Marvin was a hero who had been reduced to a biological resource by the corporate negligence. His final moments were spent protecting the survivors from the truth of his own condition. He was a professional to the very end. The main hall was his final post, and he had held it until the fire took his mind. The loss of Marvin Branner was the end of the police investigation. There was no longer anyone to report to, and no longer any authority to uphold. The survivors were now independent actors in an urban war zone. Marvin's order echoed in Leon's mind as he moved deeper into the station. He realized that the only way to honor the lieutenant was to survive the night and expose the people responsible for the bite. The hero was gone, and the rookie was alone. Leon's solitary exploration of the West Wing forced him into a direct confrontation with the specialized horrors of the T-virus. Moving through the narrow corridors of the records room and the evidence lockers, he discovered the remains of a tactical unit that had been decimated by an unknown predator. The environment was characterized by an oppressive silence that was suddenly shattered by the appearance of the first licker. This specimen represented an advanced stage of viral mutation that had bypassed the standard zombie phase. The biology of the licker was a masterpiece of specialized lethality, designed for the dark interiors of the station. The licker was a human host that had suffered a total loss of skin and eyesight, resulting in an exposed muscular system and an oversized brain. To compensate for its blindness, the creature possessed a supernatural sense of hearing and a lethal speed. It utilized its long, muscular tongue as a primary weapon to impale and retrieve targets from a distance. Leon realized that he was no longer fighting simple reanimated corpses. He was being hunted by a predator that was designed for the total dominance of the environment. The creature moved across the ceiling with a predatory grace that ignored the laws of human movement. Biologically, the licker was a documented proof of the VACT process in an urban setting. The virus had prioritized the evolution of the host's sensory and motor systems at the cost of its higher brain functions. This mutation provided the corporation with a high-performance biological asset that could operate in total darkness. Leon had to adapt his tactical response, moving with absolute silence to avoid detection by the creature's hearing. Every floorboard creak was a potential death sentence in the West Wing. The encounter was a clinical demonstration of the power gap between the rookie and the corporate products. The presence of the lickers in the police station confirmed that the organization had successfully deployed advanced biological weapons to liquidate the survivors. These were not accidental mutations. They were the enforcers of the corporate secrecy. The creatures utilized the museum's architecture to flank and ambush the remaining officers, turning the fortress into a slaughterhouse. Leon discovered that the T-virus was capable of producing a variety of specialized forms to fit any tactical niche. The Licker was the reaper of the dark corridors, a being that thrived in the blood of the fallen precinct. The evidence room provided Leon with a record of the creature's aggression. He found the mangled remains of his colleagues, their bodies torn apart by the claws of the skinless hunter. This visceral evidence of the Licker's lethality added a layer of psychological pressure to his investigation. He was forced to manage his limited ammunition while navigating an environment where the enemy could be anywhere. The West Wing was a biological laboratory where the rookie was the primary subject. The encounter with the first Licker was the moment Leon understood that the corporation was building a new world of horror. Ultimately, the solitary journey through the West Wing established the high stakes of the night. Leon was a man alone against a system of engineered death. The specialized horrors of the T-virus were on full display, proving that the organization had mastered the prehistoric fire. The Licker was a sign of the coming apocalypse, a being that had traded its humanity for the perfection of the hunt. Leon moved forward with a heightened situational awareness, knowing that the next hallway could hold a similar predator. The police station was no longer a harbor. It was an active combat range. Part 9. Ada Wong, the FBI cover story. In the underground parking garage, Leon encountered Ada Wong, a woman who displayed a high level of tactical confidence and professional detachment. She claimed to be a federal agent for the FBI, tasked with a secret investigation into the people responsible for the Raccoon City outbreak. Leon, driven by his rookie sense of idealistic justice and his desire for organized authority, immediately trusted her cover story. He saw Ada as a professional colleague who could provide the answers and the extraction he required. This partnership was built on a foundation of calculated corporate deception. Ada utilized her FBI facade to manipulate Leon into assisting her with the retrieval of a high-value biological sample. She spoke of the corporate negligence and the need for federal intervention, hitting the specific moral triggers of the young officer. Her appearance was a clinical contrast to the biological rot of the city, representing a clean and professional force that Leon wanted to believe still existed. He became her primary tactical asset, clearing the path for her while she monitored the situation with a detached focus. The cover story was a perfect psychological bypass for the rookie's suspicion. The relationship was characterized by a clear power imbalance. Ada possessed the knowledge of the viral strains and the corporate hierarchy, while Leon was a man stumbling through the dark. She used him as a physical shield against the biological threats, observing his performance with a mixture of professional assessment and personal curiosity. Leon's desire to protect the agent blinded him to the gaps in her story and the sophisticated nature of her gear. He believed he was part of a federal operation, unaware that he was a pawn in an industrial spy game. Ada's mission was the acquisition of the G-virus for an unknown rival organization. She was not there to save the city or provide justice for the victims. She was there to secure a commodity for the global black market. The FBI badge was a tool of infiltration that allowed her to move through the police station and the underground tunnels without being targeted by the remaining authorities. Leon's idealistic dedication to his duty made him the perfect partner for her mission. He provided the muscle and the morality that she lacked, creating a unified tactical unit built on a lie. The bond that formed between them during the parking garage encounter would define their relationship for the next 20 years. Leon saw a partner who needed his help, while Ada saw a man who was genuinely too good for the world she inhabited. This clinical irony was not lost on the spy, who began to feel an unintended attachment to her tactical shield. However, her mission remained the priority. She utilized Leon's loyalty to navigate the traps of the police station, moving closer to the heart of the corporate conspiracy. The cover story was the leash that kept the rookie in line. The meeting with Ada Wong was a turning point in Leon's night. He was no longer an isolated survivor. He was a part of a larger, more complex mission. The introduction of the FBI element added a layer of political intrigue to the biological horror, since Leon believed that he was fighting for a sovereign nation, unaware that he was serving the highest bidder. The parking garage was the site of a professional alliance that was as unstable as the city itself. Ada Wong was the ghost in the precinct, and Leon Kennedy was her most effective tool. Part 10. Ben Bertolucci, the journalist in the cell. Ben Bertolucci was an investigative journalist who had successfully uncovered the link between the city administration and the pharmaceutical giant. During the height of the urban collapse, he locked himself in a high-security cell within the RPD holding area for personal protection. Ben possessed a collection of confidential files that proved Chief Irons was actively blocking the investigation into the Arclay incident. He understood that the police department was no longer an institution of justice, but a tool of corporate suppression. Leon encountered Ben while searching for a way to navigate the lower levels of the precinct. The journalist refused to leave the safety of his cell, fearing that the corporate assassins would liquidate him if he entered the open corridors. He acted as a vital source of information for the rookie officer, revealing the corruption that had poisoned the local government. Ben's files documented the bribes and the illegal communications between the chief and the corporate elite. He was a man who had dedicated his career to exposing the truth, and he found himself trapped in a tomb of his own making. The files were the primary evidence needed to hold the organization accountable for the massacre. The presence of the journalist presented a major tactical problem for the corporate cleanup operation. He was a loose variable who possessed the names and the dates of the illegal transactions. While Leon attempted to secure the key to the cell, the mechanical environment of the station began to shift. The organization had already deployed a solution to the witness problem. Ben's belief in the structural integrity of the bars was a clinical error of judgment. The walls of the station provided no protection against the next tier of biological assets. The arrival of the tyrant marked the end of the journalist's investigation. A massive pale hand penetrated the reinforced wall of the cell block with a destructive force that ignored the structural limits of the building. Ben was crushed within seconds, his skull pulverized by the grip of the super soldier. This execution was a clinical demonstration of the organization's commitment to total secrecy. The journalist was eliminated before he could hand over the incriminating evidence to the police. The files were scattered on the blood-stained floor of the cell. Leon witnessed the murder from the other side of the bars, realizing that he was facing an enemy of supernatural strength. The death of Ben Bertolucci was a turning point in the night, shifting the stakes from survival to a high-level cover-up. The rookie officer saw that the law was insufficient to stop a biological god. Ben had spent his life hunting the truth, and the truth had finally found him in the dark. The silence of the cell block was a sign that the witness phase of the project was over. Ultimately, Ben's death served as a warning of the corporate reach. Even behind steel bars, no one was safe from the organization's hand. The journalist was a tragic figure who had been consumed by the very conspiracy he tried to expose. His files remained a valuable target for Leon, who now understood the depth of the corruption. The tyrant had successfully terminated the most dangerous human asset in the precinct. The night was moving toward an absolute erasure of the corporate guild. Part 11, Mr. X, deployed, the mission of the T-103. The organization utilized a heavy lift helicopter to deploy a T-103 model Tyrant, designated as Mr. X, directly into the police station. This super soldier was a mass production variant of the Arclay research, designed for the total dominance of an urban environment. The creature was encased in a thick green limiter coat that suppressed its secondary mutations while providing a high level of ballistic protection. The deployment was a clinical act of corporate cleanup, intended to sanitize the precinct of all remaining threats and evidence. The Tyrant was the ultimate enforcer of the corporate will. The mission of the T-103 was twofold and strictly tactical. First, the creature was programmed to locate and retrieve the G virus sample, hidden within the pendant worn by Sherry Birkin. The organization understood that the genetic potential of the G strain was too valuable to be lost in the urban chaos. Second, the Tyrant was ordered to execute any surviving STARS members or RPD officers who could testify against the company in an international court. The creature moved through the halls with a mechanical focus, ignoring the common zombies to hunt its primary targets. The presence of Mr. X changed the tactical landscape of the police station. He was an unyielding predator that could not be stopped by standard munitions or environmental obstacles. He utilized his superior strength to smash through reinforced doors and structural walls, creating a sense of constant vulnerability for the survivors. The thud of his heavy boots became a psychological weapon that drained the mental energy of Leon and Claire. The Tyrant was a wall of grey muscle that refused to retreat, a biological engine of pure mission objective. Biologically, the T-103 represented the peak of the corporate engineering. It possessed a refined nervous system that allowed it to follow complex commands without the need for constant human intervention. The limiter coat served as a mechanical shackle that kept the host's aggression in check while providing the necessary disguise for urban infiltration. The organization monitored the creature's progress through satellite links, recording the efficiency of the super soldier against the elite human survivors. The station was a laboratory where the Tyrant was the lead researcher. The deployment proved that the organization viewed the city as a disposable resource. They were willing to unleash a god in a public building to protect their private secrets. The Tyrant did not distinguish between a criminal and an officer. It only saw mission parameters. Leon's encounter with the creature was a clinical proof of the power gap between a rookie and an industrial masterpiece. He was forced to utilize the museum's architecture to evade an enemy that he could not kill. The T-103 was the shadow of the prehistoric fire falling over the precinct. Ultimately, the presence of Mr. X signaled the end of the rescue phase. The organization was no longer trying to manage the outbreak. They were trying to bury it. The tyrant was the shovel used to dig the city's grave. His persistence and his durability made him the most significant threat in the station, a being that moved with a cold patience. The retrieval of the pendant remained his primary goal, and he would destroy anyone who stood in his path. The super soldier was the final word on the Raccoon City incident. Section 4, Claire's Night. The RPD, Part 12, Claire. Alone. The empty desk and the search for Chris. Claire Redfield reached the STARS office in the West Wing, hoping to find her brother and an organized defense against the infection. Instead, she found a room filled with the ghosts of the mansion incident and an empty desk belonging to Chris. The office was a silent witness to the decimation of the elite unit. Claire discovered a diary entry and a letter that revealed Chris had already departed for Europe to investigate the organization's primary headquarters. He had left the city to continue the war that started in the mountains, leaving his sister alone in an urban graveyard. The realization that Chris was gone was a major blow to Claire's tactical morale. She was a civilian who had entered the city with a single goal, and that goal had been moved across the ocean. The diary provided a chronological record of the STARS members' struggle to expose the truth following the 1998 incident. It spoke of the corporate cover-up and the corruption within the police department. Claire understood that her brother was a target for the organization's tactical teams. The office was no longer a harbor. It was an evidence room for a global conspiracy. The isolation of the second floor created a repressive atmosphere for the young survivor. She was surrounded by the equipment and the photographs of a team that had been systematically erased. The absence of Chris forced Claire to adopt a more independent role in the survival struggle. She could no longer rely on her brother's protection. She had to become a tactical actor in her own right. The STARS office served as a sanctuary where she gathered the initial resources for her hunt. The search for Chris had transformed into a search for the people who had forced him to flee. The corporate influence was visible even in the internal memos of the precinct. Claire found evidence that the city's leadership was actively discrediting the mansion survivors. The organization had utilized its political power to ensure that the STARS members were isolated and powerless. Chris's departure was a clinical move to survive a liquidation order. Claire was now an unintended witness to the final chapter of the Raccoon City project. The office was a room of secrets that the organization was eager to burn. Claire's journey through the East Wing confirmed that the infection had reached every corner of the station. She encountered the necrotic remains of the staff, realizing that the law had failed to protect its own officers. The absence of Chris meant that the only way to find him was to survive the night and escape the city. She maintained a focus on her primary objective, while adapting to the biological horrors of the halls. The empty desk was the catalyst for her evolution from a student to a survivor. The search for her brother was the light she used to navigate the dark. The STARS office was the moment Claire accepted the scale of the disaster. She was no longer looking for a reunion. She was looking for a way out. The evidence of the corporate betrayal provided her with a new motive for her survival. She intended to find Chris and help him finish the war against the red and white logo. The city was a biological trap, and the office was the first step in her escape. Claire Redfield was the final representative of the Star's legacy in the burning precinct. Part 13, Chief Brian Irons. The serial killer on the payroll. Chief Brian Irons was the primary architect of the local cover-up and a secret agent for the organization. He was a corrupt official who had been bribed with massive sums of money to hide the evidence of the Arclay incident and the illegal laboratory beneath the city. However, Irons was not just a corporate tool. He was a clinical serial killer who utilized the outbreak as the excuse to hunt human trophies. He had turned the police station into his private taxidermy studio, collecting the remains of the citizens and the staff. The chief was a human monster who was more dangerous than the infected. Claire discovered the true nature of Irons when she infiltrated his private office in the heart of the precinct. The room was decorated with the stuffed remains of exotic animals and the macabre trophies of his human victims. Irons had been using the chaos of the week to kidnap and murder survivors, including the daughter of the local mayor. He was a man who thrived in the atmosphere of death and viral rot. His psychological instability was a liability that the organization had managed through financial incentives. The chief was a predator in a uniform. The corruption of Brian Irons ensured that the RPD was incapable of an organized response to the outbreak. He had deliberately sabotaged the communications and the ammunition supplies of his own officers to ensure they were liquidated by the virus. He wanted to erase the evidence of his own crimes, along with the corporate secrets. Irons was a man who viewed the city as a private hunting ground, where the rules of the law no longer applied. He was the definitive proof of the total collapse of the municipal authority. The chief's interaction with the organization was a clinical exchange of services. He provided the political cover for the viral research while receiving the funds to support his macabre lifestyle. However, as the situation in the city reached a critical mass, the organization began to view Irons as a loose variable. He was a man who knew too much and possessed an unstable personality. His obsession with his trophies made him an obstacle to the clinical cleanup operation. The serial killer was approaching his own expiration date in the corporate archives. Irons' attempt to hunt Sherry Birkin was his final act of industrial defiance. He recognized the value of the girl as a biological resource and intended to use her to secure his own escape. He viewed Sherry as the ultimate trophy for his collection, a being of pure genetic potential. This pursuit brought him into a direct confrontation with Claire Redfield, who acted as the primary protector of the girl. The chief was a relic of the old world of corruption, fighting to maintain his power in a city that was already dead. Ultimately, Brian Irons represented the absolute rot of the Raccoon City leadership. He was the man who sold the city to the company and then hunted the survivors for sport. His office was a testament to the darkness of the human soul when granted total authority. The serial killer on the payroll was a clinical proof that the organization chose its partners based on their lack of morality. Irons died as he lived, a predator who was eventually consumed by the very biological fire he helped to fan. Part 14. Sherry Birkin, the girl in the vents. Sherry Birkin was the 12-year-old daughter of William and Annette Birkin, and she became the most valuable biological target in the city. She was found by Claire hiding in the ventilation shafts of the police station. utilizing her small size to evade the larger predators. Sherry possessed a specialized pendant that contained a high-value sample of the G virus, making her a priority for the corporate retrieval teams. She was a child who had been abandoned by her scientific parents and left to survive in an industrial nightmare. The girl was being hunted by two distinct and lethal forces. The tyrant known as Mr. X pursued her to retrieve the pendant for the corporate archives. Simultaneously, her mutated father, William, was tracking her by scent, seeking a genetically compatible host to seed the next generation of the G mutation. Sherry was a biological resource trapped between an industrial super soldier and a viral beast. Her survival was a testament to her instincts and the protection provided by Claire Redfield. The vents were her only sanctuary in a world of monsters. Biologically, Sherry was the perfect vessel for the organization's future research. Her DNA was a match for the G virus evolution, making her an essential component of the Birkin legacy. She was a witness to the total collapse of her family and her city, carrying the burden of her parents' scientific arrogance. Sherry's trauma was a clinical byproduct of the corporate mission. She was a human variable in a world of engineered death, a girl who had lost her childhood to a viral fire. The relationship between Sherry and Claire was built on a foundation of protective loyalty. Claire recognized the girl's vulnerability and chose to prioritize her safety over her own escape. This bond provided Sherry with the emotional support she needed to survive the night. Unlike her parents, Claire viewed Sherry as a person rather than a genetic host. This human element was the only thing that allowed the girl to maintain her sanity as she watched her father transform into a monster. The student had become the guardian of the Birkin legacy. Sherry's knowledge of the station and the underground tunnels was an essential tactical asset for the survivors. She had spent years exploring the facility while her parents worked in the labs, giving her an intuitive understanding of the layout. She acted as a guide for Claire, navigating the narrow passages and the hidden rooms to avoid the tyrant. Sherry was a silent witness to the end of the city, moving through the blood-stained halls with a cold and focused fear. The vents were the arteries of the station, and Sherry was the heart. Sherry Birkin represented the innocent cost of the pharmaceutical arms race. She was a product of the corporate culture that valued genetic potential over human life. Her survival was a clinical miracle that challenged the organization's control over the incident. The girl in the vents was a reminder that the fire did not just burn the buildings, it burned the future. Sherry's journey through the night was a movement from an abandoned child to an international survivor. She was the final piece of the Birkin puzzle. Part 15, the first Birkin encounter, the machinery room fight. The first direct confrontation with the mutated William Birkin occurred in the underground machinery room beneath the police station. Claire and Sherry were intercepted by the creature, which had already evolved into its primary G Stage 1 form. Birkin was no longer a recognizable human being. He was a mass of distorted muscle and a giant, lidless eyeball embedded in his shoulder. The creature possessed a raw physical power and an unyielding aggression that tested Claire's tactical resolve. The machinery room was the site of a biological judgment. Birkin utilized a massive industrial pipe as a primitive weapon, smashing through the environment to reach his daughter. He was driven by the G virus instinct to find a compatible host for procreation, and he viewed Claire as an obstacle to his evolutionary goal. The creature moved with erratic and violent speed, displaying the initial instability of the G mutation. Claire was forced to utilize the narrow catwalks and the heavy machinery to evade the beast's reach. The fight was a visceral demonstration of the power gap between a human and a G host. The massive eye on Birkin's shoulder was a clinical indicator of the virus's sensory evolution. It allowed the creature to track movement with a high degree of accuracy, even in the dark environment of the basement. Claire realized that the eye was the primary weak point of the mutation, focusing her fire on the exposed organ to stun the beast. This encounter confirmed that the G virus produced a predator that was fundamentally different from the T virus zombies. G. Birkin was a being of spontaneous and infinite growth, a monster that was constantly rewriting its own DNA. The machinery room served as the acoustic chamber for Birkin's screams, which were a mixture of human agony and viral rage. The creature still possessed the remains of William's voice, adding a psychological layer of horror to the engagement. Claire understood that the monster was Sherry's father, a fact that made the violence even more tragic. The fight was not just a struggle for survival. It was a desperate attempt to protect a child from her own parents' legacy. The G virus had turned the father into the ultimate threat to his own family. The defeat of the Stage 1 mutation provided a temporary reprieve for the survivors. Birkin fell into the darkness of the lower levels, allowing Claire and Sherry to reach the parking garage. However, the combat data confirmed that the creature was not terminated. The G virus possessed a supernatural regenerative ability that ensured the host would return in a more powerful form. The encounter was the first chapter of a long and bloody evolution. The machinery room was the graveyard of William's humanity and the birthplace of the G nightmare. Ultimately, the first Birkin encounter established the unique threat of the G mutation. Unlike the Tyrant, which followed a tactical program, Birkin was an agent of biological chaos. He was a being that sought to expand and consume everything in its path. Claire's victory was a testament to her situational awareness and her dedication to Sherry. The fight proved that the survivors could match the prehistoric fire with the right tools and the right timing. The machinery room was a clinical proof of the Birkin failure. Section 5, Into the Sewers, Part 16. The Underground, the umbilical cord of the city. Beneath the burning streets of Raccoon City sat a massive industrial sewer system and a secret cable car network that functioned as the primary connection to the underground laboratory. This infrastructure was the umbilical cord of the organization's local operations, moving research materials and personnel between the precinct and the nest facility. The sewers were a dark and toxic environment that had been claimed by the biological failure. The tunnels were filled with the remains of the corporate cleanup and the mutated wildlife that had escaped the labs. The underground was a logistical masterpiece that operated outside the knowledge of the city's population. It featured reinforced walkways, specialized filtration systems, and the secret transport links that allowed the pharmaceutical giant to operate with total secrecy. Leon and Ada utilized these tunnels to bypass the surface barricades, moving deeper into the heart of the corporate conspiracy. The sewers were a clinical record of the organization's hidden power, a world of concrete and steel that lived beneath the feet of the citizens. The umbilical cord was now a path for the survivors, The biological environment of the sewers was saturated with the T virus and the G virus runoff. This had resulted in the mutation of the local fauna, creating an ecosystem of predators that were as dangerous as the zombies above. Giant spiders and infected insects patrolled the drainage pipes, utilizing the dark and the damp conditions to ambush the intruders. The sewers were a localized apocalypse where the human survivors were the primary food source. The team had to navigate an environment that was fundamentally hostile to human life. The cable car system was the final link to the Nest laboratory, a high-speed transport that moved through the deep earth. It was a sterile and clinical contrast to the filth of the sewers, representing the gateway to the corporate inner circle. By securing the cable car, the survivors were moving toward the final confrontation with the people responsible for the disaster. The underground was a mechanical timeline of the organization's rise to power. Every tunnel led closer to the truth and closer to the end of the city. The infrastructure also included a variety of hidden security rooms and storage bunkers. The organization utilized these spaces to hide the evidence of their illegal research and to store the tactical equipment for their private military units. The survivors discovered the logs of the corporate operatives who had been liquidated during the initial leak. The sewers were a graveyard for the men who did the organization's dirty work. The umbilical cord was a path of blood and iron that spanned the entire urban center. The underground represented the total integration of the corporation into the city's life. They owned the water, the waste, and the paths beneath the ground. The sewers were the physical evidence of a company that had built its empire in the dark. Leon and Claire's movement through the tunnels was a clinical descent into the reality of the Raccoon City project. The umbilical cord was about to be severed by the final destruction of the lab. The sewers were the last stop before the end of the world. Part 17. The giant alligator. The waste disposal accident. In the deep drainage tunnels, Leon encountered a T-virus infected alligator that had achieved a massive size of 50 feet. This creature was a clinical example of a waste disposal accident, a localized mutation caused by the persistent exposure to the laboratory runoff. The alligator had lived in the sewers for years, consuming the discarded biological materials and the failed experiments of the organization. It had become a top-tier predator that dominated the aquatic environment of the tunnels. The creature was a biological juggernaut that ignored the laws of natural growth. The alligator utilized the cramped and flooded passages to hunt its targets with unyielding aggression. It was a wall of scales and muscle that could crush a human in a single strike. Leon was forced to initiate a high-speed retreat through the maintenance tunnels, utilizing the environment to stay ahead of the massive jaws. The creature proved that the T-virus could turn even a common animal into a weapon of mass destruction. The sewers were a nursery for accidental gods, and the alligator was the king of the waste. The termination of the predator required a creative tactical response. Leon utilized a massive gas canister found in the drainage system, positioning it within the path of the advancing beast. As the alligator clamped its jaws on the canister, Leon detonated the fuel with a single shot. The resulting explosion vaporized the creature's head, ending the threat with a clinical efficiency. This victory proved that even the largest biological anomalies were vulnerable to environmental variables. The waste disposal accident had been successfully liquidated. Biologically, The giant alligator was a record of the organization's negligence. They had allowed their viral waste to create a monster that eventually blocked their own logistical paths. The researchers had ignored the predator because it was not part of their official project, treating it as a minor environmental detail. However, the alligator had become a tactical obstacle that threatened the corporate cleanup operation. The creature was a reminder that the fire did not just burn the labs, it burned the world around them. The encounter provided Leon with a visceral understanding of the scale of the disaster. He realized that the city was home to horrors that had no names and no mission parameters. The alligator was a being of pure biological hunger, a monster that existed only because the company refused to clean up its own mess. The sewers were an archive of industrial sin, and the alligator was the most visible chapter. The death of the beast was a moment of tactical relief in a night of constant pressure. Ultimately, the giant alligator was the final sign that the natural order in Raccoon City was dead. The environment had been rewritten by the pharmaceutical giant, turning a drainage pipe into a prehistoric hunting ground. Leon's victory was a sign of his growing confidence as a survivor. He had matched the raw power of the monster with the tools of the industrial age. The waste disposal accident was over, but the source of the rot was still waiting in the labs below. The tunnels were clear for the final descent. Part 18. Annette Birkin, the scientist and the mother. Annette Birkin was a lead researcher for the organization and the primary architect of the G virus, along with her husband. She was a woman of high intelligence and professional focus who had dedicated her life to the perfection of the biological god. During the night of the outbreak, Annette moved through the sewer tunnels with a desperate mission to protect the G sample and eliminate the intruders. She viewed everyone in the city, including the police and the spies, as a threat to her life's work. Annette was a scientist who had lost her humanity to a viral obsession. She encountered Leon and Ada in the drainage passages, initiating a high-stakes firefight to prevent them from reaching the laboratory. Annette recognized Ada as her industrial spy and was determined to keep the G virus out of the hands of the rival organizations. She shot at Leon with a clinical precision, revealing that her husband was the monster wandering the tunnels. Annette was a mother who had abandoned her daughter to protect a viral vial. This internal conflict defined her actions throughout the night, making her an unpredictable and lethal actor. Biologically, Annette understood the G virus better than anyone still living in the city. She knew that the mutation was infinite and that her husband was beyond rescue. She carried the weight of the disaster on her shoulders, realizing that her own research had destroyed her family and her city. However, her professional ego refused to let her destroy the virus. She wanted to preserve the sample at any cost, treating the G strain as the only legacy that mattered. The scientist had eclipsed the mother in the dark of the sewers. Her suspicion toward Ada was a clinical assessment of the global black market. She knew that the rival groups would use the G virus to create an even more dangerous world of bioterrorism. Annette saw herself as the final guardian of the corporate secret, a woman who was willing to die to protect her industrial commodity. Her interaction with Leon was characterized by a cold detachment, as she viewed the rookie as a naive pawn of the spy, and the sewers were the battlefield where her professional life was coming to a violent end. Annette's role in the incident was one of tragic authority. She possessed the keys to the vaccine and the knowledge of the mutation stages. She was the only person who could help Sherry, but she chose to focus on the virus until the very end. Her obsession with the G strain was a symptom of the corporate culture that valued genetic potential over human life. Annette Birkin was a victim of her own success, a woman who had built a Reaper and was now being consumed by its shadow. The tunnels were her final laboratory. Ultimately, Annette represented the scientific hubris that led to the Raccoon City incident. She was a woman who believed she could control the prehistoric fire through clinical discipline. Her failure was a testament to the chaotic nature of the virus. She died as a witness to the total destruction of her world, realizing too late that the mother should have been the priority. Annette's story was the closing chapter of the Birkin legacy, a tragedy of cold science and blood. The sewers were the grave of her ambition. Part 19, Ada and Annette, the confrontation over the railing. The confrontation on the industrial catwalk served as the definitive clash between the industrial spy and the corporate scientist. Ada Wong cornered Annette Birkin in the lower levels of the sewer system, demanding the surrender of the G virus sample. This engagement was a clinical demonstration of the high-stakes biological war. Annette possessed the keys to the laboratory, while Ada possessed the tactical reach of a global syndicate. The two women represented the competing interests of the pharmaceutical market. The catwalk was a precarious stage for a world-ending commodity. During the struggle, Annette revealed the true nature of Ada as a corporate infiltrator. She stripped away the FBI cover story, exposing the clinical deception that had been used to manipulate Leon. Annette understood that Ada was not a federal agent, but a mercenary who sought to sell the G virus to the highest bidder. This revelation added a layer of professional hostility to the encounter. The two women were fighting for the possession of a biological god that had already destroyed their city. The air was thick with the scent of chemical runoff and viral rot. The pendant carried by Sherry Birkin was revealed to be a specialized storage device for the G mutation. Annette explained that the jewelry was never a gift. It was a secure container for the organization's most valuable research. Ada realized that her objective was closer than she had anticipated, focusing her predatory intent on the girl. The confrontation was a battle for the future of the biological arms race. Annette was a mother who was willing to kill to keep her secrets buried. Ada was a spy who was willing to burn everything to retrieve them. The physical struggle on the railing resulted in a catastrophic fall for the scientist. As Ada pushed Annette over the edge, the researcher plummeted to the lower levels of the drainage system. This act of cold, tactical violence confirmed Ada's commitment to her mission above all human variables. She stood alone on the catwalk, her focus entirely on the retrieval of the pendant. The fall of Annette was a sign of the total collapse of the corporate leadership. The archive had been successfully isolated from its guardian. Biologically, the confrontation proved that the human element was the most unstable variable in the viral project. The personal vendettas and the industrial greed had outpaced the safety of the laboratory. Ada remained a ghost in the machine, her eyes fixed on the target while the city melted around her. The sewer was a graveyard for the men and women who thought they could own the prehistoric fire. The confrontation on the catwalk was the final act of the corporate defense. The spy had won the first round of the underground war. Ada utilized this moment to recalculate her tactical approach. She realized that Leon was a useful but compromised asset who could no longer be trusted with the truth. She continued her pursuit of the G virus with a clinical detachment, ignoring the physical trauma of the fall. The sewers were a labyrinth of concrete and steel, and Ada was the master of the environment. The confrontation had provided her with the information she needed to finish the job. The path to the laboratory was now clear. Part 20. Sherry infected, the G embryo and the mutation clock. The biological tragedy of the night reached its peak when William Birkin successfully cornered Sherry in the underground tunnels. Driven by the G virus directive for procreation, the mutated father implanted his daughter with a G embryo. This act was a visceral demonstration of the total loss of the man's humanity. Birkin saw Sherry only as a genetically compatible host for his evolutionary legacy. The parasite was a biological anchor that would eventually rewrite the girl's DNA. The tunnels were the site of a horrific paternal betrayal. The implantation process triggered a clinical timeline for the girl's mutation. Without an immediate vaccine, the G embryo would consume the host's nervous system and motor cortex within hours. Sherry was now a carrier of the infinite mutation, a biological time bomb that was ticking in the dark. The virus required a specific genetic match to survive, and Sherry was the only host in the city who met the criteria. This genomic compatibility ensured that the embryo would develop into a successful G organism. The girl was a vessel for a biological god. The G embryo would eventually cause a total organ rupture as it grew within the thoracic cavity of the host. The mutation clock was a clinical reality that forced Claire Redfield to find a cure inside the very lab where the virus was born. Every second spent in the sewers was a second lost to the viral expansion. Sherry suffered from an increasing state of physical trauma and neurological pain. Then the parasite was an invasive fire that was burning through her childhood. The girl was a victim of a science that had no respect for the human form. Biologically, the infection confirmed that the G virus sought to ensure its own longevity through the seeding of the next generation. Unlike the T virus, which resulted in stagnant necrosis, the G strain was an engine of constant growth. Sherry's body was a laboratory where the evolution was occurring at a supernatural rate. The researchers had documented this process in their files, calling it the spontaneous generation of life. The girl was a living record of the Birkin failure. The clock was a weight that Claire carried through the tunnels. The search for the vaccine, known as Devil, became the primary tactical objective for the survivors. This was a specialized chemical agent designed to neutralize the G mutation before it could reach the final stage. The organization had kept the cure hidden within the high security zones of Nest. Claire had to navigate an environment of engineered death to save the child she had sworn to protect. The infection was a clinical pressure that tested the resolve of the student. The sewers were a tomb that was slowly closing around the girl. Ultimately, the infection of Sherry Birkin was the most important law beat of the night. It proved that the virus was a predatory force that targeted the future of the species. The G embryo was the final legacy of William Birkin, a being that sought to replace the human race with its own distorted offspring. Sherry was the innocent catalyst for the final descent into the lab, The mutation clock was a sign that the time for the city was over. The girl was a carrier of the apocalypse that was waiting to be born. Part 21. Leon shot, the bond and the choice. The pursuit of Annette Birkin led to a high-stakes confrontation on the thermal vents of the laboratory perimeter. During the firefight, Annette fired a shot intended for Ada Wong, but Leon Kennedy jumped in front of the bullet. The rookie officer took the round in his torso, suffering significant physical trauma to protect the woman he believed was a federal agent. This act of selfless heroism was a clinical shock to the spy, who had never encountered a person genuinely willing to die for her. The wound was the foundation of a permanent bond. Leon's collapse on the catwalk forced Ada to face a professional dilemma. She could stay and treat the wound of her tactical shield, or she could continue her pursuit of the G-virus sample. In a moment of clinical pragmatism, Ada chose to go after Annette instead of helping the man who had just saved her life. She prioritized the mission over the human variable, leaving Leon to recover on his own. This choice revealed the cold nature of the industrial spy. The mission was a commodity that could not be delayed by a wounded officer. The gunshot wound acted as a biological filter for Leon's night. It slowed his progress and drained his physical energy, but it also solidified his dedication to Ada. He viewed the injury as a necessary cost of his duty, unaware that the woman he protected was his primary enemy. The pain was a constant reminder of the high stakes of the Raccoon City incident. Leon moved through the tunnels with a heavy gait, driven by a rookie sense of justice that the virus could not erase. The bond was a shackle of loyalty. Ada's decision to leave Leon was a calculated move to secure the sample before the self-destruct sequence could be triggered. However, the emotional impact of his sacrifice began to compromise her professional detachment. She realized that Leon was too good for the world of bioterrorism and espionage. This sentiment would define their complex relationship for the next 20 years. The bullet was the bridge between two different worlds. Ada was a reaper who had found a reason to hesitate. The catwalk was the site of a silent realization. The tactical consequence of the shot was a temporary separation of the partners. Leon was forced to find a different path to the laboratory hub, encountering a variety of biological threats while in a compromised state. This ordeal tested his resilience and his situational awareness to the absolute limit. He was a man fighting through a haze of pain and viral rot. The organization recorded his progress, noting the extreme survival instinct of the RPD rookie. Leon was a successful data point for the human element. The shooting of Leon Kennedy was a clinical demonstration of the power of the human bond. In a city of monsters and betrayal, he had performed an act of pure loyalty. This moment changed the narrative of the night, from an industrial theft to a personal drama. Ada's choice to pursue the sample was a sign of her professional ambition, but her memory of the shot would haunt her career. The bullet was the final truth of the parking garage alliance. Leon had bled for a lie, and the spy had noticed. Section 6, Nest, Part 22, Descending into Nest, the Corporate Heart. The descent into the secret facility, known as Nest, was a clinical movement from a 1990s city into a world of futuristic science. While the streets of Raccoon City were filled with burning wreckage and outdated infrastructure, the laboratory was a state-of-the-art complex that was decades ahead of the human species. It featured automated research terminals, high-grade containment units, and a central hub that managed the entire viral catalogue. Nest was the biological heart of the organization's North American operations. The descent was a one-way trip into the dark. The visual language of the facility was characterized by a sterile and oppressive minimalism. Every room was a laboratory dedicated to a specific nightmare. The survivors discovered plant-human hybrids known as Ivy, which were a recorded proof of the organization's attempt to merge the botanical and the organic. These creatures patrolled the greenhouses, utilizing their toxic spores and their vine-based limbs to eliminate intruders. The laboratory was a garden of engineered death, where the natural order was a discarded theory. The prehistoric fire was fully industrialized here. The facility also housed massive cold storage units, where the various viral strains were maintained in a state of permanent readiness. The survivors moved through the sub-zero temperatures, realizing that the organization possessed enough biological fire to burn the entire planet. The laboratory was a warehouse for the apocalypse, managed by a computer system that had no empathy for the human host. The descent into Nest was a movement toward the absolute core of the conspiracy. The researchers had built a kingdom of concrete and glass beneath the feet of the dying citizens. The architecture of the lab was designed to be a self-contained ecosystem. It possessed its own power grid, its own filtration systems, and its own security protocols. The organization utilized the facility to operate with total secrecy, away from the prying eyes of the federal government. Every hallway was a clinical record of the 30 years of research that started in the Arklay Mountains. The laboratory was the definitive proof of the Spencer dream. The survivors were entering a world where the only power that mattered was the one in the test tube. The descent confirmed that the organization viewed the city above as a disposable resource. Raccoon City was merely the shield that protected the laboratory from the world. The researchers worked in a clean and clinical environment, while the streets were being claimed by the necrotic rot. This duality was the final proof of the corporate arrogance. They had built a god and were now watching the world bow to it. The laboratory was the altar where the humanity of the species was being sacrificed for a higher evolution. Ultimately, Nest was the end of the line for the Raccoon City project. It was the place where the viruses were perfected and the super soldiers were born. The survivors' presence in the lab was a clinical containment breach that threatened the corporate legacy. The descent was the final act of the investigation, a movement into the heart of the fire. The laboratory was a tomb of high-tech science that was about to be erased from the map. The descent was the start of the final countdown. Part 23. The G virus. Sample. The purple vial and the truth in the high-security zone of the West Wing. Leon successfully located the final vial of the G virus. The purple liquid was contained within a specialized canister, representing the ultimate goal of the night's conflict. As he held the vial, Leon realized that this single biological sample was the reason for all the death and the destruction he had seen in the precinct and the sewers. It was the liquid god that William Birkin had died to protect. The canister was a heavy weight that contained the future of the biological arms race. At this moment, Ada Wong reappeared with her gun in hand, finally dropping her FBI facade. She demanded the surrender of the G virus sample, revealing her true nature as the industrial spy. The professional lie that had held the partnership together was officially terminated. Leon was forced to face the reality that the woman he had believed to protect was a predatory mercenary. The confrontation was a clinical clash between rookie justice and corporate greed. The purple vial was the only variable that mattered in the room. The truth of the sample was a documented horror. The G virus was an agent of infinite evolution that could rewrite the host's DNA in a constant cycle of mutation. Leon saw the purple liquid as a curse that needed to be destroyed, while Ada saw it as a commodity that would secure her career. This ideological gap was the final barrier between the partners. The laboratory was the site of a silent judgment. The organization's research was finally in the hands of the people who were about to dismantle it. Ada's betrayal was a calculated move to secure the merchandise before the self-destruct sequence erased the facility. She spoke of the reality of the world, where the viruses were a commodity for the highest bidder. Leon's rookie sense of duty was a relic of a world that no longer existed. The confrontation was a visceral display of the power of the prehistoric fire. The purple vial was the light that revealed the darkness within the human heart. The standoff was a clinical conclusion to the parking garage alliance. The sample represented the total collapse of the Birkin legacy. It was the only thing left of William's life's work, a concentrated flame of viral energy. Leon realized that if the vial left the facility, the nightmare of Raccoon City would spread to the entire planet. He stood his ground against the spy, refusing to become an accomplice to a global disaster. The laboratory was a tomb of high-tech science, and the purple vial was the final secret. The standoff was a moment of absolute tactical tension. The G virus sample was the catalyst for the final separation. It proved that the organization's reach was global, and that the fire could not be contained by a single man. Ada's mission was approaching its climax, and the rookie was the final obstacle. The truth was written in the purple liquid, a being of pure genetic potential that had no place in the human world. The laboratory was melting around them, and the sample was the only thing that remained stable. The standoff was the end of the lie. Part 24. William Birkin's final forms. The biological engine of consumption. As the laboratory approached total destruction, William Birkin mutated through his final and most horrific stages. During G Stage 3, the creature developed a massive secondary set of arms and a more stable muscular structure. He was a four-armed juggernaut of biological power, utilizing his increased reach to crush everything in his path. The human features of the scientist were almost entirely gone, replaced by a wall of grey muscle and an array of sensory eyes. Birkin was a clinical proof of the infinite growth of the G mutation. During G Stage 4, the host suffered a total skeletal collapse, transforming into a beast-like quadruped. The creature moved with a predatory speed that bypassed the laws of human movement, utilizing its massive jaws to consume the biological remains of the staff. Birkin was no longer an individual. He was a biological engine of pure consumption. The virus had successfully rewritten the host into a being that existed only to eat and to evolve. The man was a ghost, and the monster was the master. The final forms were a documented record of the total failure of the human genome against the G virus. The creature was in a state of permanent biological stress, its cells fighting for dominance over the genetic code. Every mutation was a spontaneous response to the combat trauma inflicted by Claire and Leon. The laboratory was the proving ground for a new race of predators, that had no place in the natural world. Birkin was the first of his kind, a accidental god of the industrial underground. The quadruped form allowed for a massive increase in physical output and sensory awareness. The creature could track its targets through the dense smoke and the thermal vents of the lab. Birkin was an unyielding force that refused to be terminated by standard weaponry. He was the definitive super soldier of the Birkin project, a being that had traded its soul for a throne of viral fire. The laboratory was the graveyard where the man had been buried under a mountain of mutation. The loss of the human element was the primary characteristic of the final stages. The voice of William was replaced by a distorted roar that signaled the total dominance of the virus. The creature was an agent of biological chaos that sought to expand into every corner of the facility. Claire's struggle against the beast was a struggle for the survival of the species. Birkin was the prehistoric fire made flesh, a flame that was consuming its own fuel. The laboratory was the furnace where the monster was forged. The final forms of William Birkin were the closing chapter of the corporate dream. The organization had sought to build a controllable god, but they had ended up with an engine of consumption that turned on its creators. The G-virus was too volatile for the industrial cage. Birkin died as a monster that had outgrown the man who made it. The laboratory was about to be vaporized, and the final forms were the last witness to the fall of the Birkin legacy. The Reaper was a quadruped beast in a white coat. Part 25. Annette's death. The extinction of the scientist Annette Birkin was eventually cornered by her mutated husband, suffering a fatal injury at the hands of the monster she had helped to create. As she lay dying in the crumbling laboratory, she realized that her and William's life's work had destroyed their family and their city. The professional obsession that had defined her career was now a clinical failure. In her final moments, she turned her attention to the survival of her daughter. The scientist was gone, and only the mother remained. Annette provided Claire with the instructions to create the devil vaccine for Sherry. This chemical agent was the only way to save the girl from the final stage of the G mutation. Annette's final act was a clinical rejection of the virus in favor of a human life. She gave Claire the security codes and the laboratory protocols required to manufacture the cure. This was a moment of supreme irony, as the scientist utilized her own research to destroy her own legacy. The mother had finally found her voice in the dark. The death of Annette was a documented tragedy of corporate hubris. She had spent 30 years building a god and had been killed by its shadow. She died in a world of high-tech science that was about to be reduced to ash. Annette's final words were admission of the total failure of the Birkin project. She realized that the fire they found was a curse that had burned everything they loved. The extinction of the scientist was a necessary step in the survival of the girl. Annette's body was a record of the trauma of the night. She had survived a fall and a firefight, only to be crushed by the raw power of the G mutation. Her death was a clinical signal that the corporate leadership was gone. There was no one left to manage the cleanup or the research. The laboratory was a tomb for the men and women who thought they were gods. Annette Birkin was the last guardian of the secrets, and she died giving the key to a stranger. Claire's interaction with the dying researcher was a moment of tactical synchronization. She accepted the responsibility for the girl and the vaccine. promising to finish what the mother could not. The instructions for the devil agent were the final legacy of the Nest facility. Annette's death was a visceral proof that the prehistoric fire was out of control. The researcher was leaving the field, and the survivors were left to face the final countdown. The extinction was total. Ultimately, the death of Annette Birkin was the funeral for the organization's North American branch. The architects were dead, and the lab was melting. The mother had made a final choice to protect her daughter from the viral rot. This human variable was the only thing that allowed Sherry to survive the night. Annette's story was a tragedy of scientific arrogance and personal regret. She died as a witness to the end of the world she had built. The scientist was dead, and the fire was burning. Part 26. Ada's Truth. The gunshot that ended the argument on the central bridge of the laboratory. Leon finally confronted Ada about her true identity. The FBI cover story had been destroyed by the evidence found in the files and the revelations of the Birkin family. Ada stood with the G virus sample, her eyes fixed on the extraction point. She admitted that she was a mercenary and that Leon had been a useful pawn in her mission. The rookie was forced to face the reality of the betrayal. The standoff was a clinical clash between the old world of justice and the new world of espionage. The argument was interrupted by Annette Birkin, who had survived her earlier fall and reached the bridge for a final strike. She shot Ada in the torso, seeking to prevent the viral sample from leaving the facility. The gunshot was the final truth of the night, a violent rejection of the spy's mission. Even with the truth exposed, Leon could not bring himself to let Ada go. His rookie sense of loyalty remained a biological variable that the virus could not erase. He was a man who still believed in the partner he had bled for. Ada was compromised by the physical trauma of the shot and the emotional pressure of the encounter. She realized that her mission was failing and that the self-destruct sequence was approaching its climax. The bridge was a precarious stage for the final act of the corporate drama. Leon stood between the spy and the scientist, a man who was fighting for a lie in a world of truth. The gunshot had ended the argument, but it had started the final countdown for the partners. The lie was dead, but the bond remained. The standoff was a documented proof of the instability of the human element. The personal vendettas of the researchers and the greed of the spies had created a situation that the organization could no longer manage. The bridge was the center of a biological war zone where the stakes were global. Leon's refusal to believe the truth about Ada was a sign of his psychological resilience and his professional failure. He was a man who was genuinely too good for the laboratory. The confrontation on the bridge was the peak of the personal drama. Ada's facade was gone, and she was revealed to be a woman who was as vulnerable as the city she had infiltrated. The G virus sample remained the only commodity that mattered, a purple liquid that was the catalyst for the final separation. The gunshot was a clinical signal that the time for words was over. The laboratory was melting around them, and the bridge was about to collapse. The truth was a bullet in the dark. Ultimately, the confrontation confirmed that the partnership was an industrial accident. Leon and Ada were two different species of human brought together by a shared nightmare. The gunshot was the final act of the Birkin legacy, a maternal strike against the industrial thief. Leon's loyalty was a tactical error that would define his character for the rest of his life. The bridge was the site of the final separation, a place where the rookie was left with empty air and the Reaper was left with the abyss. Part 27. Ada falls, the sample gone and the rocket launcher. As the bridge collapsed under the strain of the self-destruct sequence, Ada lost her grip on the ledge and plummeted into the abyss of the laboratory's central shaft. Leon was left holding only empty air, witnessing the apparent death of the woman he had tried to save. The G-virus sample fell with her, disappearing into the dark of the facility's core. This was a catastrophic failure for both the rookie and the spy. Leon was a man alone in a world of industrial fire, believing that his partner was gone forever. The fall was a documented conclusion to the parking garage alliance. Ada had successfully retrieved the merchandise, but she had lost her life in the process. Or so it appeared to the survivors. Leon was forced to continue his escape with a heavy heart and a clear mission to reach the emergency train. He carried the evidence of the corporate crimes, but he had lost the person who had defined his night. The abyss was a clinical end to the industrial espionage project. The sample was gone and the Reaper had fallen. However, the unknown survivor who would later provide the rocket launcher proved that the fall was not the end for the spy. Ada utilized her tactical gear and her biological resilience to survive the descent into the shaft. She remained in the facility, monitoring Leon's progress as he faced the final tyrant encounter. The rocket launcher was her final gift to the rookie, an industrial tool that allowed him to blow the biological god apart. The sample was gone from Leon's hand, but the spy was still moving in the shadows. The loss of Ada was a visceral trauma for Leon Kennedy. He realized that the city had taken everything from him, including his partner and his rookie idealism. The helipad was the final altar where he had to face the Reaper alone. The absence of the G-virus vial meant that the organization's primary objective had been frustrated, but the viral load was still loose in the world. Leon was a survivor who had lost his soul to the abyss. The fall of Ada was the final secret of the Nest facility. The fall confirmed that the Tyrant Project and the G mutation were secondary to the human drama. The relationships and the betrayals were the primary drivers of the night's events. Leon's struggle on the bridge was a clinical study in human loyalty under extreme stress. The abyss was the grave of the partnership and the birthplace of the veteran officer. He was leaving the lab as a different man, a reaper of the pharmaceutical giants. The fall was the catalyst for his evolution. Ultimately, the fall of Ada Wong was the most important off-screen moment of the night. It proved that the prehistoric fire could produce a miracle of survival. Leon's grief was a documented fact, but the spy's mission was still in motion. The rocket launcher that came from nowhere was the final truth of the parking garage alliance. The sample was gone, but the fire was still burning. Leon was alone on the rooftop, waiting for the final showdown with the super soldier. The abyss had taken the girl, but it had left the weapon. Part 28, Mr. X, Super Tyrant. The power limiter destroyed. The rooftop fight and how it finally ended. The destruction of the thermal power plant triggered a total environmental collapse within the laboratory, exposing the T-103 to extreme heat and physical trauma. This stress resulted in the total incineration of its green limiter coat, which acted as the primary mechanical shackle for its viral output. Without the coat, the specimen suffered an immediate and violent secondary mutation into the super tyrant. This form featured a massive increase in muscle mass and the development of large, lethal claws on both hands. The creature was no longer an infiltration model. It was a biological juggernaut designed for absolute combat. The host's internal physiology underwent a radical transition as the heart grew to a massive size, protruding from the chest cavity to power the new muscular frame. This exposed organ became a visible weak point, but the creature's increased speed and aggression made it nearly impossible to target. The super tyrant moved with a predatory focus, utilizing the cramped space of the emergency lift to corner Leon Kennedy. The organization monitored this final engagement, recording the lethal efficiency of the limiter-free specimen. The rooftop was the site of the final clinical trial for the T-Virus project. The combat data confirmed that the super tyrant possessed a physical output that far surpassed the human limit. It could leap across the platform and strike with a force that shattered the industrial flooring. Leon was forced to utilize every remaining resource to stay ahead of the monster's reach. The encounter was a documented proof of the power gap between the rookie and the corporate masterpiece. The creature was an unyielding engine of destruction that refused to retreat, even after suffering significant ballistic trauma. The battle was a visceral demonstration of the prehistoric fire's raw energy. The tactical intervention of an unknown survivor changed the course of the engagement. A high-grade rocket launcher was dropped onto the platform, providing Leon with the only tool capable of overcoming the creature's regenerative hide. This weapon was an industrial answer to the biological god. Leon utilized the ordnance to strike the exposed heart, triggering a catastrophic internal explosion within the host. The super tyrant was reduced to a cloud of biological debris, ending the corporate cleanup mission with a single, decisive strike. The Reaper had been terminated on the threshold of the escape. The termination of the specimen provided the survivors with a final path to the emergency train. The organization had lost its primary enforcer and its most expensive urban asset. The data from the fight was a mixture of professional success and tactical failure. While the tyrant had performed with extreme lethality, it had failed to secure the viral sample or eliminate the witness. The rooftop fight was the closing chapter of the T-103 lineage in Raccoon City. The super soldier was dead, and the fire was consuming the lab. The physical remains of the creature were left to be vaporized by the coming self-destruct sequence. There was no biological material left for the rival organizations to scavenge. Leon moved toward the train, with the knowledge that he had killed a god. The encounter had hardened his tactical resolve, turning the rookie officer into a veteran of the biological war. The super tyrant was a memory of a corporate empire that was about to be erased from the map. The lift was descending toward the end of the nightmare. The presence of the rocket launcher suggested that the spy was still active within the facility. Ada Wong had provided the tool for Leon's survival, maintaining her role as a shadow guardian even after her apparent fall. This act of tactical support was the final proof of the bond that had formed during the night. The organization's plan had been sabotaged by a human variable they could not calculate. The rooftop was the final altar where the corporate ambition was sacrificed. The fire was out and the train was waiting. Section 7, The Escape. Part 29, The Self-Destruct. 5 minutes, 1 train, 3 people, and everything. Nest was taking with it. The activation of the self-destruct sequence turned the laboratory into an industrial furnace. The survivors were granted 5 minutes to reach the emergency train before a thermobaric explosion leveled the entire complex. The objective shifted from investigation to a pure sprint for life. Leon and Claire reunited at the lower levels, loading unconscious Sherry onto the cars while the facility melted around them. The clinical environment of Nest was now a countdown to an absolute erasure. Every second was a measurement of their survival. So the sequence was designed to liquidate all remaining biological and digital assets within the lab. The organization was pulling the trigger on 30 years of research to prevent the evidence from reaching the surface. The survivors moved through corridors filled with steam and failing security systems, fighting the last of the laboratory's predators. The psychological pressure was absolute as the digital voice announced the end of the 1998 era. The umbilical cord of the city was about to be severed by a wall of fire. The lab was a tomb that was being sealed by the clock. The logistics of the escape required a total synchronization of the team. Leon managed the security bypasses while Claire monitored Sherry's condition. They were a unified unit of survivors in a world of engineered death. The emergency train was their only harbor, a mechanical vessel that could carry them through the final explosion. The facility was suffering from a total structural failure, with the walls collapsing and the viral containment tanks breaking. The survivors were moving through a biological graveyard that was being purified by the flames. The decision to save Sherry was a moral victory that challenged the corporate logic. The organization viewed the girl as a host, but the survivors viewed her as a human being. By loading her onto the train, they were taking the most valuable piece of the Birkin legacy away from the fire. This act was a clinical defiance of the corporate mission. The self-destruct was a fire that consumed the guilty and the innocent alike. But the survivors were the only variables that refused to stay in the furnace. The train was moving toward the sunrise. The 5-minute window provided a clinical demonstration of the organization's ruthlessness. They were willing to vaporize a billion-dollar facility to protect the board of directors. The survivors were moving through a world that was being systematically dismantled by the men in the suits. The laboratory was a factory of death, and the self-destruct was the final product. The sprint to the train was the movement from the underground dark toward the morning light. The investigation was over, and the escape was the only truth left. The train car acted as a localized sanctuary in a world of chaos. As the engine ignited, the survivors felt the vibration of the coming explosion beneath the tracks. They were leaving the heart of the conspiracy and entering the future of the biological war. The organization had lost its labs and its architects, but the survivors carried the memory of the massacre. The self-destruct was the final act of the corporate cleanup, a fire that was supposed to hide the truth. The train was the only thing that escaped the erasure. The final seconds of the countdown coincided with the train entering the extraction tunnel. The survivors watched as the facility behind them disappeared into a white light. The explosion erased the Nest laboratory and the T-virus catalog in a single moment of industrial violence. The city was still burning above them, but the source of the rot had been neutralized. The self-destruct was the end of the Raccoon City project. The survivors were the only ones who knew the price of the prehistoric fire. Part 30, Birkin's last form, the final mutation on the train and what it cost to stop it. The final mutation of William Birkin occurred within the confined space of the emergency train. Designated as G Stage 5, the creature had suffered a total loss of biological structure, transforming into a colossal wall of teeth, eyes, and tentacles. He was a formless engine of pure consumption that sought to integrate the train car into his own biomass. Birkin was no longer an individual or a beast. He was a biological phenomenon that had outgrown the laws of the species. The train was the site of the final clinical termination of the Birkin bloodline. The creature utilized its massive tentacles to latch onto the walls of the car, pulling itself forward with unyielding aggression. The human elements of the scientist were lost in a sea of distorted flesh and viral rot. Birkin was the unyielding force that ignored the physical trauma of the survivors' weapons. Leon and Claire were forced to utilize every remaining bullet to detach the rear car and isolate the monster. The fight was a visceral struggle against a being that refused to die. The train was a biological war zone in motion. The biology of the Stage 5 mutation was a documented proof of the G virus's infinite potential. The creature was an agent of pure chaos that sought to expand until it consumed the entire world. The eyes on its surface monitored the survivors with a cold and alien intelligence. Birkin was the prehistoric fire made flesh, a flame that was consuming its own host to stay alive. The train was the furnace where the final evolution was occurring. The survivors realized that the only way to stop the god was to leave it in the dark. The detachment of the car was the final tactical move of the night. As the coupling shattered, the remains of William Birkin were left in the tunnel, while the survivors moved toward the surface. The coming explosion of the facility reached the tunnels, vaporizing the creature in a massive fireball. The G virus host was officially terminated, ending the threat of the spontaneous generation. The man and the monster were gone, leaving only the daughter behind. The cost of the victory was the total destruction of the Birkin legacy. The fight on the train proved that the virus was a predatory force that had no place in the human world. It had turned a brilliant scientist into a wall of screaming meat. The survivors had matched the raw power of the monster with the logic of the industrial age. The termination of Stage 5 was a clinical necessity for the future of the species. The train car was a sanctuary of steel that carried the 3 survivors away from the god. The fire was finally out in the tunnels. Ultimately, the final mutation was the definitive end of the corporate dream. The organization had sought to build a god, but they had ended up with a formless horror that turned on its creators. The G virus was too volatile for the human container. Birkin died as a witness to the total failure of his own science. The laboratory was gone, and the final form was a memory of a disaster that would define the next 50 years. Jean the Reaper was a mass of teeth on a burning track. Part 31, Out of the Tunnel. The sunrise, the 3 survivors, and the city that was already scheduled for destruction. As the emergency train exited the tunnels and reached the city outskirts, the survivors were greeted by the first light of a new day. Leon, Claire, and Sherry walked away from the tracks as the sun rose over the burning horizon of Raccoon City. They were the only 3 people who knew the complete truth of the night's events. The silence of the forest was a visceral contrast to the industrial violence of the laboratory. The 3 survivors were the ghosts of a city that was already scheduled for total destruction. The psychological impact of the sunrise was profound. Leon Kennedy had entered the city as a rookie officer and was leaving as a veteran of a biological war. Claire Redfield had found the truth of her brother's departure and a new purpose as a protector. Sherry Birkin was the orphan of Industrial Project, carrying the vaccine and the memories of her family's fall. They were a makeshift family, forged in the prehistoric fire. The sunrise was a sign that the night was over, but the war was just beginning. Leon vowed that the Raccoon City incident was just the start of his fight against the organization. He realized that the red and white logo was a global threat that could not be stopped by a single police department. He committed himself to the dismantlement of the pharmaceutical giant, a goal that would define his entire career. The survivors were the world's first anti-bioterrorism specialists. They were the witnesses who would tell the story of the massacre to a world that was still in denial. The city behind them was a graveyard that was waiting for the final cleanup strike. The government had already authorized the nuclear termination of Raccoon City to prevent the spread of the infection. The survivors were walking away from a target zone that was about to be erased from the map. The organization had successfully manipulated the political leadership into an absolute cover-up. The 3 people on the road were the only loose variables in a clinical plan of erasure. The city was a funeral pyre for the 1998 era. The transition from survivors to actors was the final law beat of the night. They were no longer victims of an accident. They were the hunters of the corporate elite. The experience in the station and the lab had rewritten their identities. They carried the evidence of the G virus and the betrayal of the RPD leadership. The sunrise was a light that revealed the path to the future. They were moving toward a world that was already infected by the corporate greed. The survival of the 3 individuals was a clinical failure for the organization's containment protocols. They had escaped the tyrant, the G mutation, and the self-destruct sequence. They were the evidence that the prehistoric fire could be survived by the human element. Their story was the weapon they would use to bankrupt the company. The road ahead was a long and bloody journey toward the truth. The city was a memory of blood and iron, and the survivors were the legacy of the fallen. Section 8, The Parallel Story, Part 32, HUNK Wakes Up. The sewer, the sample, and the only member of Alpha Team. Still breathing, miles away in the municipal sewer system, the operative known as HUNK regained consciousness amidst the biological remains of his team. He was the only member of the USS Alpha Team to survive the initial encounter with the mutated William Birkin. While his colleagues had been slaughtered by the G-Beast, HUNK had utilized his extreme survival training to maintain his clinical focus. He woke up in a world of toxic waste and viral rot, his first objective being the assessment of his mission status. He was the lone wolf of the pharmaceutical giant. The operative discovered that he still possessed an intact vial of the G virus sample. This purple liquid was the primary objective of the mission, and its retrieval was the only priority that remained. HUNK displayed a total lack of empathy for his fallen team, viewing their deaths as a tactical detail of the operation. He established communication with the corporate extraction team, announcing that the merchandise was secure. He was a professional who operated outside the limits of human morality. The sewers were his laboratory for the final extraction. HUNK's survival was a clinical proof of the organization's elite training program. He was a man who had been forged in the high-stress environments of the secret labs, becoming a human tool for the corporate will. He moved through the drainage pipes with a cold and focused speed, avoiding the biological threats that had claimed his squad. The USS operative was the perfect soldier for the biological era, and a being that valued the mission above his own life. The sewer was an environment he had mastered. The retrieval of the G virus was the most important lore beat of the parallel story. While Leon and Claire were focused on survival and justice, HUNK was focused on the corporate profit. He was the shadow that ensured the organization's legacy would continue even after the destruction of the city. The sample in his hand was the catalyst for the next generation of biological weapons. HUNK was the bridge between the Raccoon City disaster and the global arms race of the future. The lone wolf was carrying the fire to a new master. The operative's nickname, the Grim Reaper, was a documented record of his combat history. He was the only survivor of multiple high-risk operations where everyone else had been liquidated. This pattern of survival was a clinical anomaly that the organization valued. HUNK was the biological anchor of the USS force, a man who could not be killed by the prehistoric fire. He moved through the blood and the waste with a mechanical precision. The sewers were the grave of his team, but they were the path to his extraction. The parallel journey of the fourth survivor provided the final tactical context for the night. It showed that the organization's reach was absolute, and that their best operatives were still moving in the shadows. HUNK was the counterpoint to Leon's rookie idealism, a man who saw the virus as a product rather than a curse. The retrieval of the sample ensured that the nightmare of Raccoon City would never truly end. The lone wolf was leaving the city with the keys to the future. Part 33. The fourth survivor. The confirmed canonical escape. Through a collapsing Raccoon City. The journey of HUNK through the collapsing infrastructure of the city was a clinical demonstration of elite tactical movement. He fought his way from the lower sewers through the blood-stained halls of the RPD and onto the roof for extraction. He moved through an environment that was populated by the most aggressive predators in the corporate catalogue, including the Lickers and the Ivies. HUNK ignored the dying screams of the citizens and the plight of the survivors, focused entirely on the safety of the merchandise. His escape was the definitive proof of the USS effectiveness. The route through the police station was a high-stakes gauntlet of biological fire. HUNK utilized his heavy weaponry and his situational awareness to bypass the swarms of the infected. He viewed the city as a tactical map of bottlenecks and kill zones. The precinct was a graveyard that he utilized to reach the extraction point. The operative's movement was characterized by a cold and mechanical efficiency. He was a being that thrived in the chaos of a total containment failure. The fourth survivor was a Reaper in a gas mask. The organization monitored his progress via satellite, recording the performance of the G virus carrier against the urban threats. Every kill confirmed the reliability of the USS gear and the training protocols. HUNK was a living advertisement for the corporation's private military services. He was a man who could navigate apocalypse and deliver the product on time. The extraction helicopter was waiting on the roof, a mechanical harbor in a city that was about to be vaporized. The mission was approaching its successful conclusion. The escape through the city provided the final data points for the corporate cleanup operation. HUNK's success proved that an elite soldier could survive the T-virus environment if they maintained a clinical focus on the objective. This information was utilized to refine the training of the future tactical units. The fourth survivor was a benchmark for the industrial super soldier. He had matched the prehistoric fire with the discipline of the corporate machine. The rooftop was the final stage of his professional demonstration. The extraction was a moment of absolute tactical relief for the organization. Though they had secured the G virus sample and a veteran operative who could provide the mission report, the helicopter departed the roof as the city began to suffer from the final structural collapse. HUNK sat in the aircraft, his eyes fixed on the purple vial. He had fulfilled his contract and survived a world of monsters. The Reaper was leaving the field, and the merchandise was secure. The city was a memory of fire. The canonical nature of his escape confirmed that the organization had won the first round of the viral war. They had lost their labs, but they had kept the pathogen. HUNK was the human variable that ensured the continuation of the arms race. His presence in the city was a clinical strike that achieved its primary goal. The fourth survivor was a ghost who had walked through the graveyard and out the other side. The mission was a total success for the lone wolf. Part 34, what each of them did next, the immediate aftermath and the global shift. The immediate aftermath of the Raccoon City incident resulted in a total shift in the global biological arms race. Leon Kennedy was recruited into the US government as a specialized agent, utilizing his experience to combat the spread of the viral load. His rookie justice was transformed into a professional mission to dismantle the organization. Claire Redfield left for Europe to continue her search for Chris, eventually joining the anti-bioterrorism group known as TerraSave. They were no longer civil servants. They were the world's first specialists in the prehistoric fire. Sherry Birkin was taken into government custody, serving as a biological ward due to the unique properties of her post-mutation DNA. Her life became a series of clinical tests and high-security residences. Ada Wong vanished into the shadows, successfully delivering a piece of the G virus tissue to her rival organization. She remained a ghost in the industrial network, a mercenary who would continue to influence the biological war for decades. The survivors were scattered across the globe, each carrying a different piece of the Raccoon City truth. HUNK successfully delivered the G virus sample to the pharmaceutical giant's European branch. This ensured that the nightmare of William Birkin would continue in a new laboratory. The organization utilized the sample to refine their future projects, including the Tyrant and the Nemesis programs. The corporate fire was burning hotter than ever in the hands of the elite. The lone wolf had fulfilled his contract, maintaining his status as the most reliable operative in the company's history. The arms race had become decentralized and global. The total destruction of Raccoon City by a nuclear strike was the final act of the cover-up. The government erased the city and its population to hide the evidence of the corporate negligence. This event sparked an international scandal that eventually led to the legal bankruptcy of the pharmaceutical giant. However, the viral research survived the corporate collapse. The prehistoric fire was now a commodity for the highest bidder. The world was entering a new era of biological fear, where the tyrant was the standard. Each of the survivors carried the psychological weight of the night into their new roles. Leon and Claire remained in contact, acting as a unified front against the rising tide of bioterrorism. Sherry's childhood was defined by the laboratory that saved her life and the government that owned her blood. Ada continued her dance with Leon, a reaper who was always one step ahead of the law. The Raccoon City incident was the catalyst for their evolution. They were the architects of a new world that was fighting to stay human. The final law beat of the 1998 incident was the realization that the umbrella might be gone, but the reign of the gene was still falling. The organization had been dismantled, but its research was now in the hands of a dozen other companies. The fire was loose in the world, and the survivors were the only ones who knew how to fight it. The night in Raccoon City was the beginning of a 50-year war. The survivors were the legacy of a city that was erased from the map.